optimism the values of freedom, opportunity, accountability, and compassion.
Through the work of the George W. Bush Institute, we aspire to show the world America's best. One way we do that is by bringing people together to find solutions that bridge ideology, nationality, and creed. We focus on ensuring opportunity for everyone. We believe that all Americans should have a chance to succeed. That means a quality education and an economy that rewards innovation and replaces poverty with prosperity. We work to advance free societies around the world. Freedom brings responsibility, including a respect for human rights and the rule of law. Ultimately, free societies and free people are the world's best hope for peace and stability. For example, we've screened millions of women in sub-Saharan Africa for cervical cancer. We're working with veterans to get them into high-quality mental health care across the country. We've also developed best-in-class analysis on how to get great leaders in schools across our country.
Our convening power is unmatched. We bring people to this great facility on this great campus and online through our public programming, our publications, podcasts, and thought-provoking journals.
Having the Bush Center here is really the crown jewel of the campus. Everyone associated with SMU is extremely proud of it.
We are honored to be on this great campus and be able to partner with the SMU community and its world-class faculty. And we've always enjoyed sharing our programs with SMU students and the broader community.
In addition, principled leadership never goes out of style. President and Mrs. Bush have set the example, and we want to follow it.
My hope is that the Bush Center will always serve as a place where timeless principles are celebrated, protected, and promoted. We've had a great start. Now we must make sure our mission endures for generations to come.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Executive Director of the George W. Bush Institute, Holly Kuzmich.
Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to a special edition of Engage at the Bush Center, presented by NexPoint. Thank you all for joining us. President and Mrs. Bush, thank you for being here tonight. And special thanks to all of our board members and Executive Advisory Council members for being here as well. Tonight's program is the annual NexPoint Lecture. It's a special night for our presenting sponsor. We're grateful to NexPoint for endowing our Engage series and for enabling us to regularly bring newsmakers and experts to the Bush Center. Our goal with the Engage series is to increase understanding and advance conversations on important topics of the day. And with tonight's program, you're going to get just that. We'll be talking about an issue that's not only timely and relevant, but vitally important to freedom around the world. Now to say a few words and introduce our headliners, please help me welcome the Chief Communications Officer at NexPoint, Lucy Bannon.
Thank you, Holly. We're excited to welcome you all to the 5th annual NexPoint Lecture, part of the Engage series here at the Bush Center. When NexPoint launched this partnership with the Bush Center, we identified the NexPoint Lecture as a way to devote one program each year to topics that impact the global economy. So tonight, we focus on geopolitics, framed around Bill Browder's harrowing experiences taking on Vladimir Putin and corruption in Russia. While Bill has told his story in 2 New York Times bestsellers, he is much more than an author. He is the founder and CEO of Heritage Capital Management and was the largest foreign investor in Russia until 2005. Since the murder of his attorney, Sergei Magnitsky, Browder's advocacy has led to the passage of the Magnitsky Act in 34 countries. These laws have the power to sanction human rights abusers and kleptocrats all around the world. He holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Chicago and an MBA from Stanford Business School. And fun fact, he and Bush Center CEO Ken Hersh were grad school classmates at Stanford. We are also pleased to be joined by David Kramer, who is the Bradford M. Freeman Managing Director of Global Policy at the Bush Institute, and also happens to be an expert on Russia. Next month, David will succeed Holly Kuzmich as Executive Director of the Bush Institute. And prior to joining earlier this year, David taught at Florida International University and was a senior fellow in human rights and diplomacy. David spent 24 years in Washington, where among other roles, he spent all 8 years in President Bush's administration at the State Department. And his senior roles there include Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. He earned a master's in Soviet Studies from Harvard University. And then we are also thrilled to have Bush Center President and CEO Ken Hersh, who will guide us through what we know will be a very compelling conversation tonight. But before we begin, we've got a short video to play that will hopefully provide some helpful context.
Freezing Order is the story of how my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, discovered a $230 million Russian government corruption scheme, how he exposed it, and how he was killed for doing so by the Putin regime. Afterwards, we went and tried to figure out who got that money. We traced that money all over the world and went right up to Vladimir Putin. People often ask me if I'm scared going after Vladimir Putin, and the answer is no. Putin tries to use fear to cow people into submission, and I won't be cowed into submission. My lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, stood up to Putin in far more dangerous circumstances, and it's my duty to Sergei not to be afraid and to continue standing up for Sergei and for other victims of Russian human rights abuse.
And with that, please join me welcoming David Kramer, Bill Browder, and Ken Hersh.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you for mentioning that Bill and I were classmates back in 1987 to 89, we haven't changed a bit, Bill. You look like such a fun, nice person. Little did we know what was in store for you. So get rid of that picture.
I just saw that picture.
Okay, fast forward from March of 1989, when that picture was taken, July 16th, 2018, there was a meeting in Helsinki between then President Trump and Vladimir Putin. Tell us what happened.
So, July 16th, I was just about to start writing Freezing Order. I was in Aspen, Colorado, and I had cordoned off my dining room so my kids wouldn't disturb me. Took my computer and disconnected from the internet, put my phone on silent, and tried to start writing. If anyone's ever written a book, you'll know it's not easy with a blank sheet of paper. I deleted, I typed, I deleted, I typed, I deleted. An hour later, I had nothing to show for it. I turned my phone over, 176 new messages. First one said, Bill, are you watching Helsinki? Second one had some expletives that I won't repeat. Third one said, Bill, if you need a house in the mountains to hide out, I've got a place. Basically, so I turned on the press conference from the Helsinki summit between Trump and Putin. So the summit was on a Monday. The previous Friday, Robert Mueller had indicted 12 Russian military intelligence officers. Summit was taking place on the Monday. Trump and Putin go into the room. They have their meeting. They come out into the press conference. And one of the journalists raises his hand from Reuters and says to Putin, are you planning on handing over the 12 military intelligence officers? And Putin smiles. He's been preparing for this question all weekend. And he says, yes, it's entirely possible that we would hand these people over, but we would expect some cooperation and reciprocity from our American counterparts. Specifically, we would expect that the United States would hand over Bill Browder. So there's 7 billion people on the planet. I was the one guy that they... So this was upsetting, of course, but Putin has been chasing me all around the world since the Magnitsky Act was passed, and with Interpol arrest warrants and so on and so forth. And he's brought me up before, and so I wasn't surprised. Then the next obvious question was to President Trump, and so one of the journalists says to President Trump, "What do you think?" And Trump says, "I think it's an incredible offer." Now that did surprise me. So.
And then what?
Then they all make their way back to Washington, and then Putin must have realized overnight that he had sort of opened too low, and so the Americans were asking for 12. He was only asking for 1, so he added 11 others, including my friend David Kramer right here.
The next day.
The next day. And basically, he added 11 more people who were involved with the passage of the Magnitsky Act, and David has been, which I think we'll talk about in a minute, and a bunch of other U.S. either former or current U.S. government officials. So we thought immediately that they would immediately Trump would immediately sort of reject this thing. But silence for 3 more days, and then there's a press conference where. The New York Times asks Sarah Huckabee Sanders, are you planning to hand over Bill Browder and David Kramer and these others? And this was the moment that she should have said, of course not. But she said, well, the president is still considering it. He's consulting his advisors. And the next day, the Senate was going to have a vote on whether to hand us over or not. And about an hour before the vote, Trump very meekly walks it back and says, we're not going to do it. And then the Senate, an hour later, passes a vote 98-0 not to hand us over. So I'm really delighted to be here tonight.
Well, and we're delighted to have you. And David, we're really delighted that you're here too. But I want to back up a little bit in your story, and I don't want to regurgitate too much of the past because it's in these 2 wonderfully gripping books, and we could spend all night on any single story. But in the volatility that you lived through, running money, investing as a hedge fund and investor in Russia, when Putin came on the scene, you thought he was a good guy, that he was bringing law and order to the markets and whatnot, and trying to establish the rule of law, and you were his fan. When did that turn? And give us that context.
So when Putin came to power in year 2000, he succeeded Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin was, in many ways, a good president. He believed in democracy, and he believed in free speech, and so on and so forth. But he made one crucial mistake, which is that he handed over 40% of the economy to 22 individuals, 22 oligarchs. And in doing so, he created the most horrible disparity of wealth that's ever been experienced anywhere in the world. 150 million people living in destitute poverty, 22 people living like unbelievable, like kings. And that really poisoned the whole country. It was just horrible. Professors became taxi drivers, nurses became prostitutes, art museums sold the paintings off the walls. The whole situation was just terrible. And so by the time Putin came to power, everyone was longing for somebody to return it to normal. And for the first couple years, that was sort of his deal. He was trying to take away the power from the oligarchs and return it to normal. And he behaved like he was not drunk like Yeltsin was. He was kind of a technocrat. He was very boring. And that's what the world wanted, was some sort of boring technocrat. And he wasn't like he is right now. And so I was kind of, and I think most people would never admit that they were supportive of Putin, but in the first couple of years I was, and many other people were too. But then he did something which sort of changed everything, which is that he was really angry with these oligarchs who were stealing all this power from him. And the oligarchs were just really running riot over everything. And so he arrested the richest oligarch in Russia, a man named Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was the owner of an oil company called Yukos. He pulled him off of his private jet in Siberia. He brought him back to Moscow. He put him in a courtroom. And in Russia, when you go on trial in a criminal case, there's a 99.7% conviction rate. And so they put you in a cage, because that's where you're going to be when you're convicted. And so they put him in a cage, and they allowed the television cameras to film the richest man in Russia on trial sitting in a cage. Imagine you're the 17th richest guy in Russia. You're on your yacht, parked off the Hotel du Cap in Antibes. You just finished up with your mistress in the bedroom. You wander out in your underwear to the living room. You flick on CNN. And there you see a guy far smarter, far richer, far more powerful than you sitting in a cage. What's your natural reaction going to be? You don't want to sit in the cage. And so after Khodorkovsky was convicted the next year, and sentenced 10 years, these oligarchs went to Putin and said, what do we have to do to make sure we don't sit in a cage? Putin says, real simple, 50%. Not to the government or to the presidential administration of Russia, 50% to Vladimir Putin. That's when he became the richest man in the world, and that's when it became clear that he had no interest in getting rid of oligarchs. He just wanted to become the biggest oligarch himself. And the more money he had, the more power he had, it just kind of, it just kind of rolled. And there's an expression that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that's what happened with Vladimir Putin.
And so then you're running your business, the Magnitsky, the raid on your offices, the theft of $230 million from the Treasury. Sergei Magnitsky, he did not want to come out back to London because he believed that if he turned over the truth, that truth will out, and that he's a Russian and the bad guys will be taken care of. Did you find this corruption to be so endemic that it just didn't matter, that it just doesn't matter what the truth is, and as a result, nothing could have transpired differently than what happened?
Well, so Sergei Magnitsky was my lawyer. My offices were raided after I was expelled from Russia in 2005. My offices were raided in 2007. These documents that were seized were then used to perpetrate a very complex fraud in which my company in the previous year had paid $230 million of taxes to the Russian government, and a bunch of police officers, tax officials, and organized criminals. The police seized the documents from my office, and they used these documents to illegally refund $230 million. Now, this wasn't money, this wasn't my money, it was Russian government money. Sergei had figured this out, and Sergei and I were both convinced that that Putin was a nationalist and a patriot, and he might have tolerated me being ripped off, but his own government being ripped off to the tune of $230 million that's not a thing that a patriot would do. And so we thought it must be a rogue operation, and if we were to publicize this, bring it to the attention of the people at the highest level of the Russian government, then the good guys would get the bad guys. And so we wrote criminal complaints to the head of every law enforcement agency in Russia. We went to the TV, radio, newspapers, explained the whole thing. Sergei gave sworn testimony to the Russian State Investigative Committee, their version of the FBI. And we sat back and waited for the good guys to get the bad guys. It turns out that in Putin's Russia, there are no good guys. Instead of arresting the people who stole the $230 million, the same officers that Sergei testified against came to his home on the 24th of November, 2008, and arrested him, put him in pretrial detention, where he was then tortured to get him to withdraw his testimony.
So David, let me jump to you. You've done so much work on this region, and a lot of work on kleptocracy and corruption. Why does it matter? If Russians steal from Russians, why do we care? I mean, you know, if this is as these countries, I'll call it mature, they go through this phase. Why does it matter?
Well, Ken, first let me just say it's a real privilege to be up here on the stage, well, with both of you, but with Bill in particular, because of, I think, the heroic work he's done in trying to bring accountability in a country that lacks it, and also tries to stop the enabling behavior that we in the West are frankly guilty of. And I think the reason it matters is because there is a real intersection between authoritarianism and corruption and kleptocracy. The more corrupt leaders and officials become, the more authoritarian they're likely to become. They can't afford to lose power. And then when they run out of ways to clamp down internally, they'll project their power across their borders, as we're seeing this very day, even since 2014 when they invaded Ukraine. So it does matter, and we also have to be very clear in not enabling this behavior. I think this is one of the most crucial parts of dealing with this, that we need much greater transparency and disclosure in the West. Russians don't trust keeping their money in Russia. It's not safe there. They do trust our financial systems. They like to buy our real estate, buy our sports teams and others. And I think we have to make sure that ill-gotten gains are not welcome in our countries, and they are not welcome either if they engage in corrupt behavior or gross human rights abuse.
So you'd go farther than freezing assets, you would seize them?
I'd seize them. I mean, there's over $300 billion in Russian foreign hard currency reserves. The Russians were stupid enough to leave that in Western accounts. There's about 30 billion here in the United States. We have frozen all that money. We should seize all that money. That money should never go back to Russia, in my view. It should go to Ukraine to help fund the reconstruction of a country that has been the target of Russian devastation.
Okay, and we're going to get to the Ukrainian current event situation. And so for people who there's going to be so much more information, I'd encourage you to go Google around on Bill and look at the YouTubes, and you'll get all the background. Explain the relationship between the two of you, Bill, and how David Kramer helped on the original Magnitsky Act.
So after Sergei was killed, I said to myself, we have to get justice. I wanted first to get justice in Russia, but that was totally impossible. They circled the wagons. Putin got involved. Putin personally got involved in the cover-up of the murder. He exonerated all the officials involved. They gave promotions and state honors to some of the people most complicit. They even put Sergei Magnitsky on trial after they killed him in the first ever trial against a dead man in the history of Russia. So I said, we need to get justice outside of Russia. And I went to Washington, and I didn't know anything about justice or law. I was a hedge fund manager, but I met a lawyer who told me that there was actually a really interesting provision on the books. He said that President Bush had signed an executive order called 7750, which allowed the U.S. to ban corrupt foreign officials from coming into the country. I thought, well, let's try that. So I went to the State Department. This was 2010. And I got the coldest shoulder you could ever imagine, because this was the time that President Obama had embarked on something called the Russian reset. And the last thing they wanted to do was start banning Russian officials from coming into the United States. And so I came up with this idea of if the government wasn't going to help, then let's go to Congress and see if we can get a law passed. And I was able to convince a Democratic senator from Maryland, Benjamin Cardin, and a Republican senator from Arizona, John McCain, to sponsor something called the Magnitsky Act, which would freeze the assets and ban the visas of the people who killed Sergei and the people who do similar types of things. And I started to go around to lobby different members of Congress. But I was a person, just an individual with a story, didn't have any experience in Washington, had no credibility in Washington. But I found this interesting character, David Kramer, who was a like-minded fellow traveler. He was, at the time, president of Freedom House, which is the oldest human rights organization in the United States. And he, sort of in parallel, had come to the same conclusion. And he had an enormous credibility in Washington. And so he and I was kind of a risky character to go around with. I was like, who is this Bill Browder? And he was ready to sort of put his own credibility on the line. And he and I went around to different members of Congress's office. And I would tell the story of Sergei Magnitsky, and he would explain that this is the right policy tool. And with his gravitas and my story, we convinced many, many U.S. senators to sign up. And by the time we got to vote, it passed the Senate 92-4, and it passed the House of Representatives with 89%. And the Magnitsky Act became a federal law on December 14, 2012.
So that was 2 years. And then at the time, the congressional passing was so overwhelmingly positive that despite the reset, it got signed.
There's no way of vetoing a piece of legislation that passes 92-4. And
if I could just say, the Russians were lobbying vigorously against this legislation. Sergei Kislyak, the ambassador at the time, was making his rounds on the Hill. And to give you a sense of how much this touched raw nerves in Moscow, Putin, immediately after President Obama signed this legislation into law, then banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American citizens. I can't think of a more cold-hearted, vicious thing to do than to take the most defenseless citizens in Russia, who would benefit by being adopted into loving American homes, than to make that illegal. And many adoptions were broken up in the process. That's the kind of leader we're talking about.
Right. So let's then jump to where freezing order picks up, because I think that's the, there's a chapter in the book called Whack-A-Mole. I think that the title of the book could be Whack-A-Mole, because it's a chase. The whole book is a chase. You're trying to disclose where the $230 million went and try to get it frozen or seized. People are trying to unwind your efforts. At the same time, you're trying to get the Global Magnitsky Act passed, not just against Russians. Magnitsky Act in 2012 said we can sanction Russians who violate human rights, but if in other countries that wouldn't be the case for other people in other countries. Plus do it around the world, and then there were people obviously going behind you. And then you bring up Russian adoptions. So that brings us to the Trump administration. And the rebuttal on the famous Trump Tower meeting was that the topic was about adoptions. So I'll jump to the middle of the story, because I think that's an interesting follow-up. What was your reaction when you read that there was a meeting at Trump Tower that had something to do with Russian adoptions?
So, well, let's just back up a couple days. So there was, one of the things which we discovered was that some of the money from the murder of Sergei Magnitsky ended up in Manhattan real estate, in some really fancy condominiums in New York. And we took this discovery to the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice issued a federal forfeiture order over the assets, asking the court to, well, first to freeze it, and then they wanted to seize it. And their indictment was so damning, you couldn't have imagined that anyone would show up to defend it. But it turns out that someone did show up, my lawyer. The lawyer who helped me find the money, switch sides, and the Russians must have paid him a lot of money. His name was John Moscow, worked for a firm called Baker Hostetler. He went switch sides and became the lawyer for the Russians.
Which is really interesting. The guy's last name is Moscow.
Right? I mean, it's straight out of Central Casting. And the Russians had a lawyer of their own. Her name was Natalia Veselnitskaya. And she and John Moscow then spent enormous amounts of money trying to discredit me in every way possible. And it went beyond trying to defend themselves in this case about the money in New York. They started fanning out across Capitol Hill. They hired a bunch of lobbyists. They convinced one member of Congress, a Republican from Orange County named Dana Rohrabacher, to, I hear President Bush laughing over there, who then wanted to, I mean, he was on their side trying to do all sorts of things to disrupt us. And it was just incredible how much energy they put into it. And so it culminated. I was trying to get journalists to write about this woman because she was doing all this crazy stuff, and nobody seemed to be very interested. And so one day I was on an airplane. I was going to Aspen from London, and I was changing planes in Chicago, and I get this call on my mobile phone from a New York Times journalist, and she says, "Have you ever heard of a Russian named Natalia Veselnitskaya?" And I said, "Boy, have I heard of Natalia Veselnitskaya. She's made my life a misery for the last year with all this crazy stuff she was doing." And she said, "What do you know about Natalia?" And I had all sorts of information that I had been pitching to journalists for 6 months before that nobody wanted to write about. And I gave her my whole pitch and downloaded all my information. And I said, "What's this for?" And she said, "Just watch the New York Times, you'll see." And I kept on refreshing my app, and like nothing was coming. And I got on the plane, and the Wi-Fi didn't work. And I got off the plane in Aspen, and I loaded up, and it says, Natalia Veselnitskaya was in Trump Tower on June 9th, 2016, meeting with Jared Kushner, Donald Trump Jr., and Paul Manafort. And this was the first, there had been all this allegation of possible collusion between the Trump administration and Russia, and this was the first like real life meeting. And what was she doing in that meeting? She was, this was after Trump had been nominated, before he was elected. She was there to ask, if he gets elected, would he repeal the Magnitsky Act? And this was the moment that I was so happy that Obama had been so difficult about not doing all that stuff with Executive Order 7750, because we got an act of Congress. And so Trump couldn't just take a pen and repeal the Magnitsky Act. It would require an act of Congress. And thankfully, because of that, the Magnitsky Act is still here, even after 4 years of Trump.
And so following, during the years of the Trump administration, how did you, where were you spending your time to work on the global side, trying to get it more, the Magnitsky Act broadened?
So the Magnitsky Act passed in 2012.
Right.
It enraged, as you mentioned, it got Putin so mad that it had the opposite effect that he intended. He wanted to somehow scare us with all of his adoption banning, and instead, Senator McCain and Senator Cardin said, "Oh, if Putin is so upset by this, there's a lot of other dictators. We should probably do this too as well." And so in 2016, the Global Magnitsky Act passed, which applied to human rights violators in China, Iran, Myanmar, everywhere. And but it's great to have it in the United States, but bad guys travel to and keep their money all over the world. And so I needed to find other places to do it. And it's interesting because the United States is all powerful, but in a certain way that power is a bit of a double-edged sword, because a lot of countries don't want to follow the United States either out of pride or there's anti-Americanism or whatever. And so I needed another country that I thought could really set the ball rolling. And I focused my energies on Canada, because people can be anti-American, but I've never heard of anyone being anti-Canadian. And I traveled to Ottawa 20 times, and in 2017, the Canadian Parliament unanimously passed the Canadian Magnitsky Act, and that did set the whole ball rolling. And then in 2018, the British Parliament passed the British Magnitsky Act. In 2020, the European Union passed the EU Magnitsky Act, which added 27 more countries. 2021, Australia passed a Magnitsky Act. And actually, it's really interesting. Just yesterday, I discovered, I had no idea, but I was being interviewed by an Icelandic journalist, and without my knowledge, a year ago, Iceland passed a Magnitsky Act. And so there's now 35 countries with Magnitsky Acts. And so it's really it's a global phenomenon. And what it means is that assuming the countries work together, you can pretty much, if you get a bad guy on the Magnitsky list, you ruin their life, because they can't travel anywhere, they can't use their money anywhere, they can't have a credit card. It's just, particularly for somebody who kills for money and wants to then travel the world and spend their money, it's all closed.
But right now, it's not like Interpol. I mean, you have to go to every individual country and get those names added to the list. It's not like if we put somebody on the list.
No, it's not automatic. And so this is all part of the ongoing Magnitsky campaign, which is to harmonize the lists, get the countries to work together. There's a few places that we still don't have Magnitsky Acts. Japan doesn't have a Magnitsky Act. New Zealand doesn't. Switzerland doesn't.
Well, maybe they'll follow Iceland, hopefully. David, so the strategy, if our ultimate goal is behavior change, is going after 50, 60, 80, 100 oligarchs or corrupt officials, is it going to matter?
It is about both trying to affect behavior inside Russia, but it's also about our own behavior. We have to make sure that we are not complicit by enabling this kind of corrupt behavior. So in part, it's about cleaning up our own house. but it is also aimed to try to have an impact inside places like Russia. And these sanctions don't kick in and take effect and produce a different result overnight. They take a while. It takes time for sanctions to kick in and really have an impact. And so I think it is incredibly important that we continue to implement aggressively. And I would argue over the years we have not been aggressive enough in implementing these sanctions. The invasion of Ukraine has obviously changed a lot of this. But we were reluctant to put some of the closest people to Putin on this list. And we obviously weren't putting Putin on the list until February 24th.
And do you think the oligarchs, do you think they'll turn on him in some capacity? I mean, do you think pressuring these 20, 30, 40, 50 individuals will make a difference?
I don't, but I don't think they will remain as supportive of him. And you find different pressure points, and pressure points can add up to something. It's the old saying, I think, that really came into fashion with the Arab Spring movements in 2011. These regimes seem stable until they're not. And you never quite know what the tipping point is in some of these countries. It can be elections, it can be a completely stupid, idiotic decision to invade a neighboring state like Ukraine.
Okay, well that's a good transition. Bill, put the invasion of Ukraine in context, and also I would say, you know, we've had the commercial airliner gets shot down over the Ukraine. 2014, they take Crimea. We withdraw from Afghanistan in a pretty sloppy way a year ago. Draw the arc, if you will, to kind of where we are today and why we're here, and then from today, literally today, given that there's more mobilization and the word nuclear got tossed around again, and the Ukraine has turned the tide, how would you advise our strategy?
There's a lot of things in that question.
Yeah.
Let me unpack it. So, first of all, why did Putin invade Ukraine? If you were to listen to political scientists, they study every word that Putin says, and they say, well, you know, he went into Ukraine because of NATO enlargement, and or he went into Ukraine because he's got some grand vision of a Russian empire. So I'm not a political scientist, and I've watched Putin, and I know how Putin behaves, and I'm sort of came from the coalface. And the reason why Putin went into Ukraine is because over a 22-year period, Putin and 1,000 people around him, 1,000 oligarchs and corrupt officials, have stolen $1 trillion from the Russian state, $1,000 billion. And I don't just throw that out there. That's based on analysis, and in my book I kind of explain how I get there. And that's money that should have been spent on hospitals and schools and roads and infrastructure. Instead, it was spent on private jets and yachts and Swiss bank accounts for a very small number of people. And that's, you can do that for a year or 2 or 5, but to do that for 22 years, as David said, you just don't know what will be the catalyst to cause 1 million people to march on Red Square. And Putin has always been afraid of his people. He can imprison a few people, but he can't imprison the whole country. And so Putin uses war as a tool to gain and to stay in power. And it's not the first time he's used war. In fact, for him to come into power, he started a war against Chechnya. Right. How did he start the war against Chechnya? He needed a pretext. So he and his secret police, the FSB, committed a bunch of domestic terrorist acts. They blew up a bunch of apartment buildings. They blamed it on the Chechens. They were actually caught trying to blow up one of the apartment buildings.
Killed 300 people.
And then they went to war in Chechnya, and everyone in Russia was angry at the Chechens for supposedly blowing up these apartment buildings. And he went and killed 50,000 people in Chechnya, but in doing so, he became president. In 2008, he invaded Georgia. Ukraine's not the first country he invaded. He invaded Georgia, and he saw his approval rating shoot up. Then they started to meander down, and then he invaded and took Crimea and eastern Ukraine. Things started meandering down. We went through COVID, big economic thing, 22 years of stealing all this money. He was scared. And he invaded Ukraine properly with full-fledged military invasion, and his approval ratings went through the roof. That's why he's in Ukraine. You remember that movie Wag the Dog? That's what this is all about. He wanted a foreign enemy to take pressure off of himself, and it's kind of worked. Now, it hasn't worked the way, in certain ways it's worked the way he wanted it to, in that he's got a very high approval rating, and it's a genuine approval rating. People rally around the flag. People root for the home team, and they're rooting for the home team right now. He is failing in a lot of respects. But the one thing I would say about Putin, and I know him well, and I've been in my own personal conflict with him for more than 12 years, is that he can fail in all sorts of ways, and then he just doubles down and triples down and quadruples down. And I expect that he will escalate this conflict in a major, major way. I believe that he's far from being counted out, even if you believe the most optimistic scenarios. And in my opinion, the most likely outcome to this whole thing is continued war.
Okay, so David, the things that have come out of his mouth, he didn't want Putin, he didn't want NATO on his doorstep. Now NATO is closer. He thought he could take out Ukraine and Zelensky very quickly. He couldn't. In fact, now they're losing territory. He thought his military was strong. It's actually showing a lot of weakness. The things that he calculated have, there's almost nothing that has gone the way that he might have planned, or at least is what's come out of his mouth. He said, if NATO expands in Finland, there's going to be retaliation. He didn't retaliate. He said, if the West arms the Ukraine, there's going to be retaliation. He didn't. We did, and he didn't. Can this pattern continue? I mean, to Bill's point, what's his, if he keeps doubling down, is he going to reach a point where he has to take really extreme measures?
This is something where Bill and I may finally disagree on an issue. I think Putin actually has a track record of backing down when he's cornered, when he faces strength. I think a strong response from the international community, led by the United States with our allies, is absolutely critical. When we didn't follow through on the red line on use of chemical weapons in Syria, what did Putin do? He intervened militarily, saved Assad. Whenever we show signs of weakness, Putin exploits that. When we push back, he backs down. Let me give you actually 3 examples real quick. In 2015, a Russian military jet violated Turkish airspace repeatedly. The Turks warned it to back off. Russian plane continued. The Turks shot it down and killed 2 Russian pilots. Putin huffed and puffed, didn't do anything. A few months later, the Russian ambassador was actually assassinated in Turkey. 2018, Russian mercenaries, this dreadful, odious Wagner mercenary group that is just full of murderers and now active in Ukraine, were threatening our forces in Syria. We told them back off. They didn't. Our jets bombed them and killed between 200 and 400 people. The Russians didn't say a damn thing. When Putin in his book wrote about how he found a rat cornered, the rat didn't run away, Putin did. And so I think it's really important to understand that as long as we stay strong, united, and push back, Putin can't rule out the possibility of escalation. But I think the track record is more likely that he will back down. When he sees openings, when he sees weakness, when he sees disunity, he'll exploit that.
So do you think the Afghan retreat emboldened him?
It did. No, absolutely. I think it absolutely.
That NATO would be together?
That we were disengaging from the world and that we were running. And so I think it gave him the sense. I think he also worried that Ukraine was on the verge of, and I think he overestimated, and this reflects his terrible understanding of his neighboring states, that Ukraine was on the verge of joining NATO, was on the verge of joining the EU, that Ukraine was becoming a successful democracy. And Putin fears nothing more than to see countries along Russia's borders thrive as successful democracies. He worries that, well, if Ukrainians can do it, Russians might wonder, why can't we?
Right. And so now he's pushed Ukraine closer to the West in trying to keep that away.
He's done a better job of uniting Ukraine than any Ukrainian leader. No disrespect to President Zelensky, who has done, as President Bush has described him, I think the Winston Churchill of our day. I think he's done an incredibly amazing job of leading his country. But Putin has brought Ukraine together more than anyone. Right. I mean, support for NATO is now in the upper 70s, support for joining the EU in the upper 80s.
So, Bill, I mean, you've made the point that the things that Putin, if he has nothing else, he's got that Russian pride. And to David's point, if he really is cornered and is he capable of backing down, or is he stuck in an escalation of commitment problem?
Well, so part of the problem with Putin is that he lives in a world. It's like a prison yard in Russia. Yeah. It's a brutal place where if you show any sign of weakness, then your enemies will come for you. And so, I mean, I don't think that we're disagreeing with each other. In those situations, he didn't have to escalate, but I've never seen a situation where he actually negotiates anything.
True.
He never negotiates anything, because negotiation is a sign of weakness. Mm-hmm. He has to project strength and always project strength. He can do things that make him look weak and then do something even more horrible, even if it hurts him, to show strength. He's a vindictive man, and he absolutely always, there's never going to be a moment when we're going to have a peace treaty with Putin. And so in my opinion, he has no capacity. There's never going to be a situation where we can all go to the table and negotiate something. And because if he were to do that, the Russian people who hate weakness, they hate a loser and they hate weakness, they'll get rid of him. That's the reason he's doing this, is to show strength. And so I don't think that there's any chance he's going to show weakness. And on the Ukrainian side, at the very beginning of this conflict, Zelensky was begging the Russians to negotiate. And asking and asking and begging and begging. But now, after these people have been butchered and tortured and raped in so many different cities, and they've just dug up 400 more bodies, there's no way the Ukrainians are going to tolerate anything other than a total victory.
But I mean, so now what you've just said is we have one side that needs a total victory.
One side or the other, and there's no middle ground here.
So, do you think? I hate to even say it. Do you think that a nuclear exchange or a nuclear provocation has greater than a 50% chance?
I don't know what percentage to put on it. I don't think it's as high as some people are worried it is, and the reason I don't think it's as high as people worry is because it doesn't necessarily accomplish anything for Putin. So let's say that Putin sends a tactical nuclear weapon to some Ukrainian city and kills 500,000 people. Does Ukraine then capitulate and say, okay, we give up? Does the West say, okay, that's okay, you can just bomb? Do Putin's allies say, oh, we're still on your side? Does India and China and South Africa and Brazil? Right. So what does he accomplish by doing that? All he accomplishes is just making everybody hate him even more.
And David, in this week's writing, Ian Bremmer, who's been on this stage before, he wrote that in 200 days, Russia has gone from being a small China to a large Iran, being isolated, very few friends. His friends are Syria, North Korea. You know, China's transactional, India's transactional, and they're even growing concerned about this involvement. Is that isolation? Does that isolation worry you?
No, because it's self-imposed. I mean, this is all Putin's fault. No one in the West pressured him into invading. Bill mentioned the offer that President Zelensky made early in the war. Among that offer was to make Ukraine a neutral state, not pursue NATO membership. So for those who argue that NATO enlargement is the cause of this, total nonsense. The Russians had what they said they wanted, and he didn't accept it. Today, in response to Putin's announcement of a partial mobilization, whatever that means, with the possibility of some 300,000 new cannon fodder, if you will, being sent out to the battle, every Russian flight out of Moscow was booked, sold out. Russians are fleeing the country, and this has been going on for a while, but it's particularly picked up since February 24th. You had close to 1,300 arrests today in protests in about 40 cities, from what I read. The response to Putin among the people, at least, doesn't sound very positive.
Right.
In Ukraine, Zelensky has approval rating of over 90%. So you look at, Ukrainians have the morale on their side, they have the right on their side, they have the support of the international community on their side. Putin's turning to Iran and North Korea for assistance.
So let's talk about that and the Russian people. If we are going to have some kind of a march that Putin just can't ignore, or you storm the palace, if you will. 1 million people showed up into Tahrir Square. Mubarak left without a shot being fired. The tanks went out, but they didn't fire on their own people. Will the Russian military fire on their own people? Or is there enough, or what would cause, Bill, the sentiment to be enough that the people would force regime change? Because our gripe is not with the people of Russia. Our gripe is obviously with the leadership of Russia. So what could that look like?
Well, so there's one really big difference between Russia and Egypt in this particular scenario, which is that Putin, who is a very sort of scared little man, he's looked at this whole Egyptian scenario and said, how do I make sure that doesn't happen to me? Mm-hmm. And so he set up an organization called the Presidential Guard. How many people do you think are in the Presidential Guard?
Ridiculous.
500,000. And what's their job? Their job, and they're paid very well compared to everyone else, and their job is to protect the president, and their job is to fire on their own people. And so he's got all these tricks up his sleeve. Doesn't mean that it's all going to work. I mean, it only works if he has the authority to do that.
So what would it take for the people to overthrow?
Well, in my mind, the single biggest thing that could cause the Russian people to rise up is not sanctions, not economic desperation. It's not being ashamed of the human rights abuses that are being perpetrated on Ukrainians. But if the Russian people, if the Ukrainians were to expel Russian troops from their territory, to push them out, and the Russian people were to see that they had lost this war, that their leader was weak, that Putin failed, they can't tolerate a loser. And the Russian people would turn on him very, very quickly if that were the case. And so, in a certain way, the best way for us to get rid of Putin is to help the Ukrainians win the war. At the moment, we've helped the Ukrainians not lose the war. And we've been deliberately holding back some of the equipment that we could give the Ukrainians because we're afraid of what happens if the Ukrainians win the war. But that's the only way that we're going to get rid of Putin.
So let's talk about Putin turns 70 years old in 2 weeks. He's not going to live forever. I've heard you say, Putin needs to always have war. I've heard you talk about it. I want to think 20 years out, 10 years out, beyond Putin. If there's this moment, like you said, where if the people are tired of a loser, two things could happen. One is there are Russian nationalists who are grabbing the microphone saying that he didn't go in hard enough into Ukraine, and that what comes next could be worse. I heard you on the stage at Aspen this year, and you said there's a chance Navalny, been poisoned twice, but Alexei Navalny, who's in jail as a freedom fighter, could be the next president. How would you handicap which way this could go whenever that moment is and whatever the circumstances of when Putin is no longer president?
So first of all, I don't think that anyone can be worse than Putin. So let's say someone decided, some really nationalistic person said, I want, somehow they kill Putin or whatever, and they step in. What are they going to do? They don't have any. They've run out of equipment. They've run out of soldiers. I mean, Putin went in hard. So I don't see that. And this is, by the way, a myth that Putin has always wanted to perpetuate, which is that he's a very reasonable guy compared to somebody. That's just not true. He's a very, very bad guy, and there's no one going to be worse. If Putin were to die in his sleep, the next person comes in would be part of the establishment, part of the whole same thing, and would do the same thing that Putin is doing. If Putin were to be overthrown in a massive uprising, an Arab Spring type of uprising, and the whole infrastructure of secret police and so on is no longer tolerated, then indeed the Russian people will look for a very different alternative. And there's one person sitting there who's very, very clearly the alternative, and that's this young man named Alexei Navalny. Some of you will remember Putin tried to, this is an anti-corruption activist that Putin poisoned in Siberia with Novichok. He miraculously survived. He was in a coma for 3 weeks in Germany. He eventually came out. It took him months to recover from the nerve damage. He rehabilitated himself. And as soon as he was strong enough, he wanted to go back to Russia. They said, if you come back to Russia, you'll be arrested. And he got on a plane, went back to Russia, and was immediately arrested. And in doing so, he has risen to the level of the Nelson Mandela of Russia. And if there was a moment of chaos where the Russian people were looking for a new leader, I think that there's a very real chance that Alexei Navalny could be that leader. And if he were that leader, he would fix this catastrophe.
David, what should the U.S. do right now, more of?
Help Ukraine win. I think that's the most critical task we face. I think Bill's absolutely right. That Ukrainian victory, and that I define that by driving Russian forces that are occupying Ukrainian territory out of Ukraine, including Crimea. We should never recognize the annexation, illegal annexation of Crimea. Help Ukraine win, and I think Bill is right. The implications of that could be enormous. It would be a huge blow to Putin, to Putinism, authoritarianism. We got to remember China is watching what happens here. How we respond to Russia's invasion of Ukraine will have enormous bearing on whether China might decide to invade Taiwan. And so it's critically important that we maintain this support for Ukraine to help it to victory. Bill's absolutely right. It shouldn't just be to defend itself. It shouldn't just be to reach a stalemate. It shouldn't be to reach negotiations from a position of strength. I don't think this war ends with negotiations. I think this war ends with Russia's defeat, Ukraine's victory, reestablishment of Ukrainian control over its territory. And I think that will have huge implications, not just in the region, but around the globe.
And Bill, to you, what does success look like? Suppose for whatever reason, Putin wakes up one morning and says, I reread that Magnitsky memo, and I found the guys who did it. This Browder guy was right. We need to lock some people up, and I want to reassert the rule of law here, and this evidence was overwhelming. And I apologize to Mr. Browder. Will that suffice, or is this now much more about geopolitics?
Well, first of all, that's the most unrealistic thing I've ever
I
heard in my
understand.
entire life.
I had to ask.
But
You might be watching. Got to lay it out there.
But the thing about it is that when Ken and I were in business school, I was probably the least likely person to become a human rights activist in our whole business school class.
You are exactly right about that.
But what's happened to me as I've become a human rights activist, working on the Magnitsky case and working on the Magnitsky Act, is that people come to me from all over the world with terrible, unbelievable, shocking stories of things that have happened to them. And once you hear these stories, you can't not do something. And so, this has, I got involved with the Uyghurs who are fighting who are basically in a Nazi-style, genocide with concentration camps. I've gotten involved in all sorts of other situations, and once you get involved, you can't uninvolve yourself. These are just too compelling and too horrific, and so this is, I believe, my calling for the rest of my life, which is to work not just on these Russian issues, but work on human rights issues all over the world.
Right. And you're an absolute hero for doing that, and I don't want to make light of it. When you read both the books, Red Notice and Freezing Order, what strikes me is you have the means and the stamina to have spent several years trying to get Magnitsky passed. That was in 2012. It started, obviously, in 2009. And then it took till 2016 for the Global Magnitsky Act, and then you're pushing it all over the world. You have the means and the stamina, despite the people that are trying to undermine you at every step. Are you optimistic or pessimistic, or what would it take for these kinds of causes to be effective if there isn't a champion with your means and your passion?
Well, there is a champion with my means and passion,
thankfully,
and that is me. But this has actually turned into a movement that's much bigger than me. People have finally realized that that bad people do stuff for money, and if you go after their money, some of them won't do bad stuff anymore. And my dream is that all the countries in the world where dictators want to keep their money, all of them have a Magnitsky Act. And all of them start using the Magnitsky Act liberally, so that it becomes sort of an assumption that if you do torture and killing and massive corruption, you're not going to be able to travel and you're not going to be able to spend your money. And if the incentives aren't there for people to travel and spend their money, and they think there's a high probability that happens, then a lot less bad stuff happens in the world. And if that's the case, then this really has made a huge difference.
Well, before we end, I like to end these talks on a lightning round. Short answers, top of your head. Who would play you in the movie?
I thought about George Clooney, but he's not good looking enough.
If democracy were a stock, would you be long or short?
I think it's bottomed out. I would be long now.
If China were a stock, would you be long or short?
Very short.
If Ukraine were a stock, long or short?
Long.
Do you sleep well at night?
I sleep like a baby. I wake up every hour crying.
Did Salman Rushdie's situation change your perspective?
Absolutely. It's, I've been doing this for a long time, fighting Putin and succeeding and staying alive. And you start to relax sometimes and look at what happened 33 years after they did that to him.
And then last, what is your opening word in Wordle?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Good for you. That makes me happy. Bill, as you know, here at the Bush Institute, two of our major initiatives are strengthening democracy and advancing free societies. Your presence, your work, your friendship, your crusade is inspiring for us to keep on. And your presence here is humbling, and I want to thank you very much. Please join me in thanking. David, thank you for your leadership on these issues. Thanks for the team the two of you getting Magnitsky passed. I want to thank all of you. Again, thank NexPoint. We have another event coming up. It's on our website with Betsy DeVos and Debbie Burks to talk about bold ideas and bold leadership coming up in the future. And enjoy the rest of your evening. You'll be exiting through the museum, and you'll be able to see President Bush's cold wax as well as the exhibits. Thank you all for being here.